Then why do we need to know where we come from? I'll read two quotations. One by a novelist, David Lodge. He says that history is the verdict of those who were not there on those who were there. Get the point? How do we know? So we make our best effort at all times to figure out what happened 10,000 years ago and so on. Another quotation says, all histories are in a sense visits to foreign places. We cannot actually go there. So you talk about places that you cannot go to. But still, by endeavoring, we get to know more and get to learn more. And again, why history? If you recall, a few months ago, one Professor Bako of, I think, University, University, gave his inaugural lecture on the subject of the Igbo factor, history of intergroup relations and commerce in Kano. And of course, why Professor Edmund Amfodio, in his own inaugural lecture, will talk about Igbos in Kano. And of course, he badly misrepresented the Igbo presence and the history of the Igbos in Kano in the way Anyibundi Igbo would see it. And immediately, Dr. Sam Amadi gave a lecture, like a response to that lecture by Professor Bako. And Sam Amadi said that forgetting is dying. If you forget, then you are not existing. But self-awareness and other awareness are most important aspects of existence. And he says, when we forget events and their meaning, we expose ourselves to deception by competitors and our enemies. When we forget events and their meanings, we expose ourselves to deceptions by our competitors and our enemies, which is what Dr. Bako has tried to do. Tried to deceive people about Igbo. And of course, Sam Amadi rose up to that. More to say on why we must pay attention to our history. Ajele Afibo, our great historian, said, the Igbo people, like any other group of people, are anxious to discover their origin and to reconstruct how they came to be where they are. Why are we here? Why are we not in the Niger Delta or in the desert? And we've been here, we're making our life here. Their experiences under colonialism and since Nigeria's independence have emphasized for them the reality of their group identity they want to anchor into authentic history. So the war has made us realize, or should make us realize, who we are and to value it and hold it very dear. Finally, one more quote, or it's not a quote actually, but it's a narrative. During the war, Second World War, Sir Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Britain. And he kept saying to the British people on his radio broadcast every evening that the most important reason why Britain must defeat Germany in the Second World War is that it is the winner who lives to write the history. And Britain and America wrote the history of the Second World War. Germany was the bad guy. Where? Okay. But Germany fought back. Not by writing history, but with technology. So today, the German economy is far bigger and stronger than the British economy. Why we must open our eyes. Colonialism. The colonial people wrote the history of colonialism in Nigeria. And even those things they wrote, we used it to do our exams, our school certificate exams, and so on. Thankfully, there's a new book, it's out for about 3 years now, by Max Suleom. And the title is What Britain Did to Nigeria, the History of Conquest and Rule. It's a counter-history to the colonial history, using the same sources that the colonial people used, from the crown agents, from the colonial office, and digging out information that were hiding there. Iguanya, you feel the damage that Britain did to Nigeria, particularly Igbo. They took over the north, controlled it, and the west, but they couldn't figure out Igbo. Asaba, Ekumeku, na Nyoma, they couldn't figure it out. Arochukwu, they couldn't figure it out. So they wrote our history, which you have to respond to. That book is very useful if anybody can get it and read it. And nearer home, the Civil War. Who is writing the history of the Civil War? Orondiozo, Aywabundi Ajomad, right? Who are the rebels and so on. So if you don't fight for yourself, your enemies will write your own history the way it suits them, which is very, very important, which is the very reason why the repository, the Igbo repository, becomes very important. Not only UNICEF, because there are other institutions where such efforts are being made. And we have to all work together and stand tall. And what we're going to talk about today will show you what Igbos were compared to Ndi Ozo. So, the origin of Igbo. There are three broad hypotheses. Okay? The Vice Chancellor mentioned one of them already, the autochthony hypothesis, which says that Chukwu Kalundi Igbo, where we are today, now either Eri or whatever name we call it, Chukwu Zidatalia, I became the father of Ndi Igbo, where we are today. Yorubas have their own equivalent, that's Odudu was anywhere, but we know where Odudu came from, and they know where Odudu came from. I will address a bit of that today. So that is one theory about the origin of Ndi Igbo. And the antiquity of Ndi Igbo we tend to support that theory in some way. The second hypothesis is the internal migration hypothesis, that says that Ndi Igbo were at some stage, that is thousands of years ago, at the confluence of the Niger and the Benue around Lokoja. And that Ndi Igbo, Ndi Yoruba, Ndi Edo, Bini, Ndi Jukun were all one people until the point with discovery of iron and all of that, the Sebohu, and then they migrated to where they are today. As a second theory. And people like Richard Henderson, people like Okonkwo, proposed that theory. Then, of course, the external migration theory that says that Ndi Igbo see either Egypt or Israel. I think they say more about Israel. And people like Basden, G.T. Basden, and Bon Eluwa, B.O.N. Eluwa, hold that theory. But we shall show with the studies of modern scholarly approach, modern scholarly research, discount this hypothesis, because someone like Catherine Achalon actually has stated with good reason that Ndi Igbo actually predates Egypt and Israel. So you cannot originate from where you predate. Maybe it could be the other way around. So those are the three hypotheses. Now, whatever the hypothesis one believes in, one thing is very clear: the antiquity of Ndi Igbo, established. Now, pottery earthen pottery from around 3000 BC. 3000 BC have been excavated at Nsukka in 1970. Earthen pottery. That iron smelting at Nsukka and Afikpo existed, that is, smelted iron had been excavated with carbon testing to be as old as 750 years BC and 2000 years BC. Obi, 750, and Leisure, 2000 BC. And of course, we now know about the Igbo bronze and artifacts which were excavated in our present generation, which dates as far back as to the 9th and 10th century AD. Ife is 12th and 13th century, and Benin is 14th century. So the Igbo artifacts are older than Ife and Benin. So that's why I said earlier on, Nsukka and Afikpo were probably at the beginning of the Iron Age. At the beginning of the Iron Age, from the Stone Age to Iron Age, which is why Nnamdi Azikiwe went back to the foundation of iron technology and set up a university there. Another point about Igbo antiquity. This one will cause controversy. After this lecture, I expect there'll be some media reaction. But we've prepared a press release. We should cover what I said as much as possible. Prof, I hope we have the press releases ready now. Okay, thank you very much. In recent times, the Ooni of Ife has made statements that Ndi Igbo came from Ile-Ife. Made that statement several times. Ndi Igbo Jeffriano, I know no bofu, not a bike could sweep. But didn't say when Ndi Igbo got to Ile-Ife before they left, when the Yorubas left, arrived in Ile-Ife. But it is well established that Ndi Igbo were in Ile-Ife long before the Yorubas arrived there. Established. And the authorities that I'm quoting are more Yoruba than anybody else. Ndi Igbo were there and dominated Ile-Ife. Today, there's still a village in Ile-Ife, which is the remnants of the Igbos who didn't migrate away. Because the story was that Ndi Igbo were there, dominated Ile-Ife, okay, until the Yorubas came. Then, by cordial relationships and all of that, okay, Ewesebo who to succeed, or and so on. Ndi Igbo were claiming it's their rights, the Yorubas and so on. And Ndi Igbo started attacking the Yoruba elements. When they used masquerades to attack them. The Yorubas thought they were spirits. They were afraid until Moremi offered herself as a slave woman to the Igbo group. And they presented her to the king of Ndi Igbo. That's how she found the secret. Now more Abro spirit, and gave the story back to their people. And they defeated Ndi Igbo. Then migration coming back. That is the significance of Moremi in Yoruba history. That's why they call her their heroine, because she saved them and then dominated the whole place. Today, in Ile Odua, which is the palace of the Ooni of Ife, the ancient throne of the Igbo king is still there, and it's part of their ceremonies. And they have an annual ceremony which they call the AD ceremony, which marks the defeat of Ndi Igbo and their return home. It's an annual ceremony. There's a scholarly article on that. I'm not talking about them. These are all references that I'm quoting. And of course, Reverend Samuel Johnson, The History of Yoruba People. It's a big volume. Eluwa, Igbo. Aremu, Ijesakin, and Ademiluya are Yorubas. They wrote this scholarly article on the annual festival. Professor Ade Obayemi, who is one of the top Yoruba historians, and of course, Oba himself. In the disputes between Ooni of Ife and Ulubo of Ugbo land, Ife people claim that Moremi is their heroine. Olubo said she's a traitor, that she was the one who revealed the secret that led them to get away, and that the Igbo were in Ile-Ife before the Yorubas arrived. Oni said, no, the Igbo, IGPO, were there before Yorubas arrived, before Oduduwa arrived. In public, in print, in the newspapers. So what is the difference between Ugbo and Igbo? That's for another discussion, another time. But Ndi Ugbo, which is in Okitipupa in Ondo State, are probably part of that Igbo movement that left Ile-Ife. Kana Agazi, Ndi Igbo, they stay on their own, and so on and so forth. So to summarize on the Igbo history, before we go into Onitsha, it's clear that according to Katin Achalonu, that Ndi Igbo had existed as far back as 11,000 years BC. And that was 7,000 years before the first king of Egypt, who was a black man. So you can figure out where he came from. Secondly, we've talked about Nsukka and Afikpo, and they support the autochthony hypothesis. Then, of course, the internal migration suggests that Igbo, Yoruba, Edo, Jukun, and so on and so forth had an ancestral connection before they broke away. And if they did, why don't you go back and re-establish that connection? Because in Nigeria today, only open and natural one near. So we have to rediscover our connections and build a platform to address our own challenges and so on.